Good afternoon. I think it's the first time I've been to a beach party in Africa. And I have to confess that I sent my wife a message this morning saying I'm coming back to Africa tomorrow. Now, I realize some of you understand what I'm saying, but this is an unusual group of people to be invited to address. And I suppose you came out in such generous numbers because you expect me to live up to my reputation of being slightly politically incorrect and slightly outspoken about certain issues. And I will do my best. But as happened yesterday, Graham Boynton, who so generously introduced me yesterday as well as today, had told me yesterday that I was speaking at 6. And so at about 11:30, I started to take in some wine. And it was at about 2:45, actually you were speaking at 3:15, which I didn't think was particularly fair. So today, when he very kindly came to pick me up at the hotel, and he seemed to be in a bit of a rush, he said, "We have to get you there by 3. And, well, Graham, thanks very much. At least it wasn't you who plied me with wine, but the wine seemed to find me anyway, so we'll have to live with that. I think what interests me about this particular opportunity is, first of all, to touch on the title, We Are Africa. But I'd have to put to you all that no, you are not Africa, you are African. Whether you're from Czechoslovakia or Atlanta, New Zealand, or the southern tip of South America. And what we now know from the scientific evidence is that within the last 70,000 years, everybody living on this planet can be traced genetically to a very small population that came out of Africa within the last 70,000 years. It's a true story. And I think, although there were people all over much of the world prior to 70,000, the genetics, which are probably more reliable than the fossils, because fossils have to be found, genetics can be taken from individuals living today, the genetic record is very clear. There is no living person who is an exception to the statement I just made. Now, whether it's 70 or 75, it's not the issue. And one of the happy misunderstandings that a lot of people who still have a little bit of prejudice in their life, the happy misunderstanding they have is that, well, our ancestors left Africa and left those silly folks behind. And what they did with their continent, we only came back to try and sort them out later. Not true. Many Africans left Africa, and many Africans from that little nucleus that started somewhere in Eastern Africa, and there's no point in being chauvinistic about it, but somewhere in Eastern Africa, moved west, moved north, moved south, and many moved out and came back to Africa. Not in the last 400 years, as my wine bottle said yesterday in 1692, but actually came back here 10,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, and people were moving around, and people that are displaced and now live in what are called the marginal lands in southwest Africa and South Africa, the San and the Kung and people of that kind, probably got pushed down here, but many of them were living elsewhere in Africa, and we've now got fossil remains that coincide with the genetic story that anatomically modern people were living in Eastern Africa at least 200,000 years ago. Now, those people were not us, and none of the genes in those people are within us, but they seem to have gone through a bottleneck, and something happened between, let's say, between 100,000 and 70,000 years that brought a constriction of the population, a mutation occurred, and that mutation resulted in fully modern humans, and they took off in different directions, and that's what we are. And so, whether we are Africa, which I think is wrong, whether we are African, that is true. Now, a lot of people, I'm not so sure about that, but anyway, it is there. Secondly, I think it's important to say that, again, I'm not sure how welcome this will be, but the study of genetics demonstrates beyond any doubt whatsoever that this, what would I call it, pigmentally challenged color that most of us are in this room, i.e. no color, that's worth mentioning, actually is a result of a genetic event that happened this side of 12,000 years. Prior to 12,000 years, wherever your immediate ancestors may have been, they were like the majority of people living in tropical Africa today. And there was a genetic switch that led to the loss of melanin, which gave a survival adaptation to those who had gone north. I think the second misnomer that is worth pointing out is that you remind me, there's a lady here with blonde hair, and as you might imagine, blue eyes. Well, your eyes, if they're yours, as opposed to some sort of screen to trick me, which I've learned to be careful of. So you're blushing, so I guess I'm right. But blue eyes came in less than 8,000 years ago. And so these things that separate us, these things that have excited people in the United States to do what they've done in the last month or two, color-based prejudice, color-based politics, color-based immigration, all of those things are absolutely superficial and irrelevant to the planet we live on. And I think I need to make this point, and I do make this point wherever I speak. Now, because I gather from the earlier part of this beach party that we can do a bit of promotion, let me talk a little bit about Kenya, because I hear Kenya gets a sort of thumbs down on the market at the moment because we've had some problems. Well, problems are problems and will always be problems. But let me reassure you that although we're having an election, there are 43 million of us who don't plan to leave. So, while some of us may get engaged and embroiled in things that might lead us to get hurt or worse, it's not a country that's failing. It's political aspirations that have failed to achieve what they want by peaceful means and are trying another means, and they will fail too. Kenya is there to stay, and Kenya will remain a stable country, I can assure you. So I want to just emphasize that. So having a little promotion for Kenya, let me now tell you one other thing, and then I'll get into the meat of my short talk. A lot of people have asked me what I've been doing since I left the Kenya Wildlife Service in 1994. I left because I was no longer able to do what I wanted to do. I'd become politically awkward, And as a result of that, decided if I really was suspected of being awkward, I would be awkward. And I formed a political party in opposition to the government. I guess that's awkward. We got into Parliament. I found it desperately dull. I left Parliament, went back to wildlife, which was also pretty dull. And so I was invited, perchance, to join the government of Kenya again by the man who had asked me to leave it several times before, President Daniel Arap Moi, who, despite our personal history, remains a very good friend. And I became cabinet secretary, head of the public service, head of the civil service. Basically, apart from my boss, I was everybody else's boss. Ministers, permanent secretaries, military generals, admirals, and whatever we had in the country. Well, for a short time, it was actually very exciting. It was a good thing to have everybody say, yes, sir. That's rare in life, that everybody is obliged to say yes to you. It doesn't last, but it felt pretty good to me. But notwithstanding that, that ended in sort of tears, and I don't need to go through the story now, but I went back to paleontology and studying human origins up at Lake Turkana, where I'd been since 1966. And in the course of that 15 years that has passed, we have confirmed the origin story. And I can tell it in a longer lecture in another place with much more detail and photographs and probably a lot more boring than I can do here. But sufficient to say that we now have a story that is pretty certainly self-evident. And so people say to me, well, why don't you tell other people about this story? Well, I can get audiences like this, I can bigger audiences, smaller audiences. So what I've decided to do, and I'm telling you now because I want to come back and tell you again, is I'm going to build an edifice. I call it an edifice because it's not really a museum, but it will be a structure that looks like a hand axe. You all know what hand axes are, I hope, and if not, you can look them up. But it'll stand in the deserts of North Kenya. It'll be 15 stories high. It'll have exhibits in the basement, and it'll be, in essence, the same gimmick as early Christians did in building cathedral. So you look up and wow, and it's the story of the human origin. Below, we will have working exhibits, technology, high technology, explaining genetics, explaining continental drift, explaining rifting, mountain building, and the story of life. It's going to cost about $100+ million US, and I commissioned the architects last week in New York on my way here. Wow. So it will happen. Now that's proof enough of two things. I must be completely crazy, and secondly, I must have complete confidence in the future of Africa, particularly my country, Kenya. And I want to emphasize that. So, there are too many Kenyans in this room. So having said that, let me then turn to what I'm supposed to deal with here. I came into the world as a son of paleontological parents. I became extremely interested in the fossil record. I looked at the fossil record. I did my best to get people to work with me who could explain some of the intricacies of science. I'm a high school dropout, but I got a few honorary degrees on the way. But in the process, I've learned a great deal about extinction. And wildlife today is a fraction in Africa of what it was once before. We have lost so many species, and we lost those species long before the conferences like this involving travel people from all over the world, listening to travel people from Africa trying to persuade you that we or they are Africa. You're all from here. when you help us by marketing us, it's not charity, it's repairing your mother's home. So please. Please bear with us. But having said that, and having noted briefly my concern with extinction, there is no question that the Africa where, in quotes, the native was bare and running around as an attraction, the wildlife was everywhere for the non-African, in that sense, to see, those days are gone. There's absolutely no reason why Africans, indigenous Africans, should live cheek by jowl with wildlife that destroys their livelihoods. It doesn't make any sense. It's not what's happened in Europe, it's not what's happened in Australia, it's not what's happened in America, it's not what's happened in Central America. Nowhere in the world are modern people expected to be part of the world and live with wildlife uncontrolled. Now I say that because, yes, we know that the traditional view of traditional life is that the nomadic pastoralists like the Maasai and many other people across Africa had a continent that was filled with wildlife, and they were here. But in those days, they didn't want to send their kids to school. And they didn't want to pick a school that was good enough to get their kids into Cambridge or Harvard or Melbourne or Sydney or Wits. They were happy to live in harmony with their environment. These people don't want to do that, and why the hell should they? Why shouldn't anyone born onto this planet have the right to an aspiration that will take them to what they believe is the top of their aspiration? Why shouldn't they send their mothers for an operation, hysterectomy, cancer, whatever it is? Why should they just be tribal? And I say this because I have listened, dare I say, not perhaps as acutely as is expected of a guest, but I have listened, and I've heard talks about getting 40,000 rand or dollars to a community. What is $40,000 to a community really going to do for that community? A lot of these people want scholarships to go to the best schools, the best colleges, the best universities. And when they're given, albeit generously, little bursaries, little scholarships, learn to grow vegetables that the tourists like to eat, where's it going to take them except into a static situation? And I think those of you in the tourism business, those of you in the conservation business, and those of you in related business have got, I think, to come to terms that we are African and we make our continent better for all, not just for the few. It's a tough challenge. But I think unless we do, your efforts and many other people who are not here to contribute to conservation are going to be contributing to something that is going to run away from you in the end. And I think we have to put serious thought to how we can make this work better. Now, I can't see very well and I can't hear very well. I've asked a few questions, but most of you are marketing, from your labels and the discussion I've had, for people to come back to Africa from faraway places, China, India, perhaps Pakistan, Australia, New Zealand, wherever. But I haven't seen anybody seriously marketing Africa to Africans. There's nobody here, as far as I can see, who's seriously marketing to Nigeria, to Ghana, to Kenya. And I think it's something you need to think about, because there is no longer an absence of wealth in Africa in hands of people who are traditionally known as Africans. And I think there's a market opportunity that if you can I don't like the word exploit, but let's say a market opportunity that you should use to develop high-end tourism for bankers and doctors and lawyers from across the African continent to come and see Kruger, or come and see some of these private conservancies that are doing so well in this part of Africa. Go up to Botswana, where they're doing incredibly well. Come up to Kenya, where you won't believe me, but we're also doing quite well. And there are many other places like Ethiopia, Southern Sudan. And the thing about marketing on the continent, for the people who live on the continent, they're far less impressed with what Mr. Trump calls fake news. They say, we have riots too. We have disease too. Let's take the kids and go and have a jolly good time in Cape Town or Malindi or wherever. And I think we're missing an opportunity, both for you to counteract the mess the world is in, where fear is the second word, but also to market in a community that have a lot of money and would have to travel less further. And dare I say it, you might be able to get a slightly lower price and make things work out. And where, because of the momentum of what is now visually political, the indigenous people participating actively in the marketing of a trade based on wildlife, I would suggest would have considerably more political muscle than is there at the moment. Now, I have to say these things because I was once charged with running an African country at a time when we were in trouble. The IMF had cut us off, largely because I'd asked them to when I was in opposition. The World Bank had cut us off. The donors in Paris had cut us off. And we were in deep trouble trying to make a budget that could help our people move along. Health, education, infrastructure, and it took a bit of time. But at that time, even though we had a little money, and I just some years before been in wildlife, when the then director of wildlife suggested that, as I knew the Kenya Wildlife Service and I knew their problem, couldn't I just quietly put a little pressure on the Treasury to give a little bit more money? You know, when you look up you look across the balance sheet and you see how many kids are not going to school, and how many children are not going to hospital, and how many elderly people are not getting any social aid, and somebody says you want to put a new fence for a rhino, it's not easy. Not if you've got a conscience. And so I think to get people like me, not like me, I hope, but people in those positions, to be more moved about the emergency of biotic conservation on the African continent, we have to have more political muscle than they had when I was in charge of government, where I couldn't afford to have said to the director of wildlife, go look somewhere else, because there was a political component to what he was saying, and it was so irrelevant to me at that time, despite what I knew, but I didn't give it a thought. Now, I've heard from many of you from other African countries here that you're not getting support from the government. There are all sorts of reasons and backgrounds to that. But what you have to have is some political muscle. Now, you know, we can go on and on about how bad it is and how corrupt they are and how awful it is and how it was better. That's not the issue. As I said yesterday to the conference that foreran this one in Stellenbosch, it's a question of not looking back, it's a question of looking forward. And if we really want to make our continent, and that's all of us, work in terms of doing something for biodiversity that practically every other country in the world has failed, we cannot afford to fail too. And if we're not going to fail, we have to start looking at some new steps and ideas that haven't really had the mileage thus far. So I think, against that title, How I See the Future, I'm concerned. I'm not absolutely persuaded. that we've got it right in every country, and I'm not absolutely persuaded we need to protect every living creature everywhere it chooses to live. As Graham mentioned, I think, I grow a few grapes in Kenya. We're one of the very few people who've made grapes actually produce berries from which you can make quite a good wine, but I don't do it commercially. But I can tell you that the cost to me of protecting my vines from predation by baboons, monkeys, antelope, eland. I've got a sopping great fence. What's the wire mesh? As many strands as I could fit in on 10 feet of electricity, discharging 7,000 volts. The buggers still get in sometimes. And I know perfectly well that a shotgun would solve my problem. Now, I do it for fun. Listen, I can buy wine like a lot of other privileged people. But the point is, there are an awful lot of people who grow their food and can't afford this issue. And so, I think we need a long, hard think, and tonight this beach party is not time to continue to be too serious. But I think unless we fundamentally accept the challenges and that we are African and Africa must preserve its wildlife for the good of future generations of all Africans, some of whom will live here and some of whom you people will bring here, we're not going to make it. And so my challenge to all of you is let's do something else. Now, again, I have a few more minutes. I don't know what Graham said, but I thought I had 14 minutes. He said I had 40. But I think we're up to 32 now, so I'll continue a little bit. I was saying to somebody earlier, and again, I think you came here to hear somebody say terrible things. I mean, I don't want to disappoint you. But, I'm staying in a lovely hotel. Lovely magazines, and a very wonderful manageress sent me a wonderful book about the hotel and all it offers. But dare I say it to those of my friends here who are of darker pigment than I am, but I think they may understand, it was not black friendly, any of these pictures. Every person of color was a waiter, a waitress, a guard, a driver, a gardener. But the people with diamonds and the people with goblets of wine in fantastic meals were all of Caucasian origin, or something like that. Now, that's a hard thing to live with if you've got any self-pride and self-identity. And although we can say we are all African, it's going to take a generation or two, and it's going to take all of you combined to visit the museum I'm building to start convincing a few people. But in the meantime, I think if you're serious, these sort of things can be addressed. You see it in Vogue, you see it in all of these glossy magazines in America, because the NAACP and some of the other rights movements have demanded that there be racial civility as well as equality. Now, I don't see it in the tourism industry at the moment except in a master-servant relationship, on the whole. Of course, there are exceptions. And so my challenge to all of you Africans is be African and pull our continent up, because it needs it. Wildlife could have an enormous impact on the economic future of many poor countries. It could be a source of enormous pride to unborn generations born on the continent about their heritage. And we cannot let this go because we've got some corrupt, stupid politicians making wrong policies. And we cannot let it go because we don't have faith in the future and we want to maximize what we take today. Let's slow up. Let's think strategically. Because the Krugers and these private conservations, the Botswana, the Congo, Southern Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, and many more, must be there for future unborn generations of Africans. And I think it can be achieved if we're strategic. If we're not strategic, I fear the worst. And you know, as I said last night, and these will be my last comments, not only are we fighting against many people who are underprivileged, economically very far down, and their expectations in their country, not only are we fighting against leaders who exploit the poor to make more money for themselves because they have no future confidence either, but we're also facing this nasty little term, climate change. It's easy to say, I don't believe that. Trump says it's not true. Well, when I was looking out across here, a surge when the ocean is 20 meters higher than it is today because the Antarctic and the Arctic melted, you're not going to have this beach party. It's going to be a cliff party halfway up Table Bay or somewhere else. Now, yeah, you can say, well, I don't care. I'm already old enough for it, 30 years. Well, that's my children's problem or grandchildren. Listen, it's going to affect all of us in all sorts of ways. And so put that aside. We're rich in this room. We can travel. But can the animals in our national parks travel anywhere? And as climate changes the environment, some places will get wetter, so dry land species will become extinct because they get tummy ache when they eat things that are too green. Some of the greener parks will become dry and they get tummy ache or hunger because they can't get what they eat. And we're going to see a massive die-off of species unless we think strategically about how we're going to save them. And it's not a question of South Africa or Botswana or Kenya or Serengeti. We've got to actually think globally on this one, not just because of the other species. And I suppose at the end of the day, which of us will be so unhappy if our grandchildren don't see elephants in the wild? There are many Europeans who don't see elephants in the wild or rhino in the wild, and yet they were there end of the Ice Age, and nobody talks about that now because they didn't see it happening. As somebody said to me this morning, the reason we're in such a crisis is it's happening so fast that in a generation you can see it happening and you can see what it's going to happen into. This surely must call upon us to use the intelligence that evolution gave us. I noticed I didn't use the other word, evolution inspired us with, to adapt, think strategically, use this funny organ up here called the brain, and not just switch it off with banalities and simplicities and political correctness. Let's lay it on the line. We've got to make it work. We've got to make Africa work. We're not going to save it all, but there's an awful lot we can save, particularly if we work together. Now, that would be my last remark. I'm sorry if I've upset some of you. But I will take maybe 3-4 questions to end it with. That's what I think some people like. So if anyone would like to throw something at me, I'll repeat the question in a way I can answer it, and then close the evening. Who would like to ask this first question? Thank you very much. Yes. I have the friend of my blonde friend here.
Wait 1 second, we got a mic here.
Don't shout.
Okay. Which country do you think is having the greatest success in preserving wildlife long term? Which country do you think has the most sensible policies?
Sensible policies?
Sensible.
You know, it's very hard to answer that question because I don't know all of the countries. I think I have to confess, I think Botswana has done particularly well. I think the private sanctuaries in South Africa has done very well. I think what's going on in bits of East Africa and Congo, I think the Virunga work that's been done on Rwanda is very positive. There's a lot of good stories out there, don't get me wrong. How much of that is government policy? How much of that is serendipity? How much of that is private sector personality? I just don't know at the moment. And the one thing I would not wish you to believe is I think governments can be the solution to all our problems. God forbid. It's not government. But government is made of people. And it's people who will solve these problems. And it's people at all levels. And I wanted to say at the beginning, and I'm going to say it now because something irritated me with a bad question and I'll forget it. I think one of the greatest things we should do is provide information. We can't educate people. I mean, listen, I left high school because they were trying to educate me. I cannot think of any more stupid effort my parents made. Why the hell should I go to school? So I didn't. And so when we say we're going to educate the children of Africa to love their wildlife, give me a break. You don't need to educate them. Give them the opportunity, not the education. Let them participate. And it's in that context that I'd like to draw attention to Derek Joubert and his lovely wife, who recently got attacked by a buffalo, very critically injured. Beverly is not at all well, but she will survive, and Derek is here and helped me get up the steps. These people have made 30 to 40 wildlife films that have been shown across the world about African wildlife. And the reason you're getting your tourists is not maybe it is, but many of you are getting a tourist because somebody has seen films like that, and Derek and Beverly have made these films, and we're exploiting the interest in Africa that these devoted filmmakers have done for us. And I just wanted to say, I don't often get to meet Derek. I'm not meeting Beverly tonight. He doesn't always think I'm his friend, but I actually am. But I want on behalf of all of you to send best wishes to Beverly, and thank you both. Now, one last question. If I get cross, I get cross because I'm leaving then. Who wants to ask the question? You're the monitor. Who's asking it? Right here? Right where? Oh, behind. No wonder I can't see. Yes, please speak. Hello.
I'm just wondering, the problems in Laikipia and Samburu area, what is your best advice for stakeholders and local communities?
Well, I know where this lady comes from, but I'll not be so gauchish to recognize her country of origin. But she gave me an opportunity to talk about my country. Listen, what happened at Laikipia, by all reasonable judgment, was illegal, improper, and wrong. A large number of armed people took their herds onto private land, broke fences. Many of the young men got drunk, got incited, burnt some properties down, shot a lot of animals just for the hell of killing things. And they will go home when it rains. They're not after foreign tourists at all. Yes, a couple of people got killed on, if you like, in the tourist galaxy, people the tourists will know. Now, the one guy who was shot first, who used to run horse safaris, he was told not to get on his horse unarmed and try and chase 300 people out of the house of his that he'd burnt down. He took a position that you might say was slightly foolhardy and said, I'm going to tell those buggers to push off. Well, they shot him very quickly. Cookie Galman, who's an old friend of mine, refused to leave her farm. She pleaded with me to help her. The Kenya Wildlife Service isn't in the business of providing protection for people. We provide protection for wild animals. But because Cookie is such a well-known character in the Western media, from books and TV and various other things, I took a decision that I would give instructions for Cookie Gulman to have protection. And we sent 60 armed men to her farm. And my last instructions 5 weeks ago before I left was make sure the lady is alive when I get back. A week ago, when most of the trouble seemed to be over, We still had some wildlife people on her farm, although most had been removed to another area of sensitivity. She decided to go out without an escort to check on something, 7 o'clock in the morning. She told the armed unit that I had sent up there defending her that she'd wait for them to finish their tea and then they could go together. As they were stirring the tea, they heard a car start and the lady took off. So tea was abandoned, they jumped in their vehicle and took hot pursuit. And I've known her for 42 years and I can tell you she drives pretty fast. Anyway, they came around the corner and there was Cookie's vehicle, the door open, people around it. When they saw the KWS team, the people took off, but they'd already shot her. They were clearly intending more than one shot or more than one treatment for this lady who is still alive. And because our guys were there, in a very short space of time, they were able to give her medevac and get her out, get a plane, get a helicopter. And she's very lucky in that an AK-47 bullet, which are pretty fast moving if they're solids, didn't damage any vital organ, went straight through her. Yes, a bit painful, not a nice thing to happen, but she's alive, and I got a message from her this morning asking me when I was going home. I said another 2 weeks, actually I'm going tomorrow. But this wasn't an anti-white issue, it wasn't an anti-tourist issue, and the Kenyan government is going to be very cautious about not letting tourists go to places where they're likely to get hurt. It's not in our interest to hide insecurity. And I would have to say to you, at the moment, even the elections don't scare us because the trouble that may arise in certain constituencies are not anywhere near the wildlife lodges and places most tourists will go to. So I would say, at the moment, I wouldn't change plans. Should things disintegrate, the Western media will certainly let us know, but we will confirm it. So, no, I don't think it's a crisis. I don't think it's a real problem. But that's why I say, in addition to Western tourists, which are fine, Chinese and African tourists might be a little more accommodating to Trump's fake news stories. No, they're not after you. They're not after your tourists. And as I said to someone, I live there. I've got kids there. We don't see any reason for alarm or despondency. And my last remark, and I say this as a compliment, but also perhaps as a wake-up, I have never, in the last 5 years, been to a gathering of this size, here or the one in Stellenbosch, without being body searched or asked for my ID. You are probably living in a bubble. Long may it last. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very good. I appreciate it. Bye. Thank you very much.